Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to look at a channel I don't believe I've done anything from up to this point. It's the Armchair Historian. I have a little bit of other stuff that I'm working on trying to get out for the channel. This is a relatively shorter video and most of the other ones are 20, 25, 30 minutes long. And so since I have so much other stuff I'm working on, this is the one I'm going to do today, but it's what caused the American Revolution. I've heard good things about this channel. I've never seen, or at least I don't think I've seen any of the videos that he's done prior. So we'll see. We'll see how, how good it is. A lot of these channels have been really, really great. There's been a couple that have been but let's see how it goes. What caused the American Revolution? Animated history. Let's get into it.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and this is episode 0 of our new series on the battles of the American Revolution. Today, why was the war fought? Before discussing the first battle of the American War for Independence,
that shot missed 18 feet left.
we must understand why the war broke out in the first place, and the simple answer of taxes will not suffice, as plenty of duties, such as the Tariff-Imposing Navigation Acts and Molasses Act, were in place decades before the Revolution and were met with almost no resistance. So understanding the causes of the revolution will help us in realizing why certain actions during the war were more important than others, and why those actions even took place. The Revolution had its roots in the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. Fighting began after a certain lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington led a small force into the disputed Ohio River Valley and began clashing with French settlers who were already present in the region. This culminated in the Battle of Fort Necessity, in which Washington was actually captured. The British sent further colonial expeditions into the American wilderness to fight the French, but were largely unsuccessful. This only served to increase tensions between the two powers. Meanwhile, in Europe, Britain formed an alliance with the Prussians to protect its holdings in Hanover should the French decide to bring the conflict into full-scale war. In response, the French formed an alliance with the Austrians to protect against Britain's new ally. Before long, the French made the first military action in Europe by seizing British Minorca in the Mediterranean. What was originally a colonial border dispute between Britain and France soon became part of a global conflict.
So this is all really well done. I don't know if I would say that it was a colonial border dispute. Like, it wasn't like Great Britain and France started at zero. They had this colonial border clash, and then things started, they started to kind of poke at each other in Europe. They didn't start from zero. Great Britain and France were not big fans of each other. That's, depending on the time period, that's a huge understatement. But what you do have is, or I guess that's like somewhat specific to this situation, is you have this ramp up where not only are they grabbing allies, but what will happen is as other bigger powers start to see what's happening, you kind of have this wave of powers jumping in for their own specific purposes or gains or whatever.
Which was joined by the Prussians, Austrians, and many other opportunistic nations.
Yep.
Altogether, the 7 Years' War ended without decisive results in every theater except North America, where the British took almost everything the French controlled at the time. Ostensibly, this was a massive gain for the British and colonies alike. France had no more territories on the continent, Spain was curtailed, and nothing stood in the way of colonial expansion. besides the British. That's right, the colonies were now barred from expansion into the American interior after King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited his subjects from settling on that land. But why would he give up such a huge financial opportunity? The simple answer is that, although the British controlled Louisiana and Canada, the Indians and French colonists who lived on that land didn't simply disappear. Western expansion would inevitably have meant another costly war, and the British, who had run up a considerable amount of debt, didn't want to spend even more money on building forts, equipping militias, and sending expeditions into the area. Furthermore, the British Crown wanted to ensure that the colonists were restricted to the coastline so that they could be managed as easily as possible.
What's always been interesting to me about this is almost everything from the British perspective in regards to the colonies is surrounding money in some way, shape, or form, right? You have it in basically every disagreement, discussion, even thought process for everything that happens here after the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, whichever you decide. It has to do with money, right? British coffers. That's what almost everything has to do with. It's always been a little bit funny to me how, a few decades after this, the Brits are trying to throw money and essentially bribe everybody in Europe they can to turn against France. Right now, I know that there's like a gap of time there, but it's not a huge gap of time. And so that's always been kind of a weird sort of juxtaposition to me, where it's like, nope, finances, finances, finances. Everything is prudent finances. We don't want the royal coffers to bleed dry. And then like a generation later, you have Britain throwing money bags at every European country they can, trying to get them to oppose France.
The Proclamation of 1763 was especially problematic for the colonists, as the entire point of migration to the New World was to claim new land. As one might imagine, this resulted in widespread discontent, which was compounded by an economic recession. Taxes in Great Britain alone were skyrocketing, and Parliament found a way to ease the strain by moving some of the burden to America. After all, it was for the benefit of the colonists that the British fought. The Americans, however, felt as though they had already paid for the war through bloodshed. In spite of these...
Well, so yes, that's absolutely true. But also there was this thought process, at least from some of the things that I've read, where the British are saying like, we did this for you, and the colonists just really don't buy that, right? Like, the thought process is like, no, you did it for you, and like, we're just kind of the pawn here, right? We're the ones like doing the colonization and the expansion and this new revenue base and everything like that. Like, we're kind of just the pawn, but the war and all of that was really for you and for the British Crown, not for us, not really for us, right?
Sentiments, George III and his Prime Minister, Grenville, imposed new taxes. When they began taxing sugar in 1764, the colonists were outraged, even though the tax had little effect. Why then were they so angry? Well, unlike any of the previous duties, this one was strictly enforced. Even minor violations could result in arrest and trial in vice admiralty courts, in which a single judge issued a verdict without a jury. This rigid enforcement made the Americans feel as though Parliament was overstepping its powers. That same year, the Currency Act was passed, prohibiting the colonists from issuing any paper money. Their already printed banknotes were now deemed worthless. The combination of the Currency Act, Sugar Act, and Proclamation of 1763 upset much of the working class, and the British didn't stop there. In 1765, the Stamp Act was introduced, which was a tax that required nearly every paper material to be printed on stamped paper, which was shipped directly from London. One peculiar issue with the Stamp Act was that it affected nearly everyone, so now it wasn't just the lower classes who were unhappy. Those who could read and write began feeling the stress of British taxation. Things only got worse with the Quartering Act of 1765, which demanded that all landowners allow soldiers to sleep and eat in their homes.
Yeah, so you can see things kind of like ramping up here, right? Like, you can see it kind of snowballing. And that's really what happens. It really is like a snowball effect that gets to, when the issues were first being discussed, the idea of outright independence was not really super popular. Like, that's kind of this misconception that, like, once the idea of revolution came, or once the idea of, like, fighting back against this stuff came, that it was immediately, okay, we're going to fight for independence. That wasn't really the case. There was kind of a slow burn towards independence. Thomas Paine's book played a huge role in that. But yeah, it's one of the things that's interesting to me is a lot of the issues that they have with the British, that the colonists have with the British, you can see clearly in some of the first laws that were created for the new United States, right? Some of the things that were deemed like super important were things that like they had just gotten done fighting over. And that sort of makes sense, right? Like, you have these very specific issues on your mind. They drive you nuts. You're willing to potentially die over these issues. And so when you get the chance to legislate yourself, those are the first things that you put out there.
In reaction to these 5 major acts, a Boston lawyer by the name of James Otis wrote, "The rights of the British colonies asserted and proved." In that best-selling pamphlet, he coined the phrase, "no taxation without representation," which would later become a battle cry of the Revolution just a decade later. The most reactive colonies to British taxation were Virginia and Massachusetts. Boston in particular suffered greatly under the new tariffs, as it was the largest trading hub in the colonies. Protest was so intense that mobs tore down a customs house and nearly destroyed the governor's mansion. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Governor Patrick Henry protested the Stamp Act and actually argued for self-governance. And in the rest of the colonies, protest groups began rapidly forming, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. Consequently, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but George III wouldn't budge. The Declaratory Act was passed that same year, which asserted that the British could justify all taxes anywhere in the colonies. After a succession of inept prime ministers...
Yeah, so think about that. What you have is you have the Parliament in Britain saying, okay, like, this is getting to be too much. There's too much heat. Let's back off here. And you have George saying, like, no. That's not what we're going to do. We can do, whatever tax we want at any part of the colonies that we want. They're my colonies. Like, that's the thought process.
The Minister of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, was practically left in charge of taxation.
And also, just, the British legislature, it also had to do with this was causing an issue for British business also.
He passed the appropriately named Townshend Acts from 1767 to 1768, which further increased tariffs in the colonies. As you might imagine, colonial protests were stronger than ever. Colonial politician Samuel Adams wrote the Massachusetts Circular Letter in 1768 calling for a colony-wide protest to the Townshend Acts. The British warned no one to read the letter, otherwise there would be serious consequences. So everyone read the letter, and when royal governors found out, they they began dissolving state legislatures. This only served to make protests even fiercer, prompting the royal governor of Massachusetts, Sir Francis Bernhard, to request support from royal authorities.
This is kind of hilarious because it's like a teenage rebellious child and like a sort of overbearing parent, where like the harder the parent tries to reel them in, the more the child rebels. Like that's exactly what this looks and sounds like.
Just a short while after the letter was published, Boston was officially occupied. 4,000 British soldiers were sent to a city that had a population of 16,000. In 1770, tensions reached their highest when a group of redcoats mistakenly killed 5 people. It would be dubbed the Boston Massacre as part of a propaganda campaign to intensify resentment against the British.
Yeah, 5 people died in the most unmassacre massacre that has ever massacred. Like, I don't know. I heard about the Boston Massacre when I was super little, right? Before I knew really anything about anything. And so until I actually got to school and learned about it, I had this like huge thing built up in my head that like, oh my gosh, they just went through and killed and pillaged everything in Boston, burned it to the ground. No, literally a handful of people died. It's a massacre because, yeah, it was propaganda.
Parliament was then forced to repeal the majority of the Townshend Acts, but the tax on tea remained, so the colonists did what they did best. This time they boarded an East Indian merchant ship packed with tea and poured 92,000 pounds of it into the harbor. This came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. In retaliation, the ports of Boston were closed until compensation could be paid for all of the lost tea. The Intolerable Acts, as we know them today, were passed a year later in 1774, and to ensure no more rebellions could take place, the famed administrator and veteran of the 7 Years' War, Lieutenant General Thomas Gage, was assigned as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in America and set sail for Boston.
Okay, so that was the first part of this series, What Caused the American Revolution by the Armchair Historian. I thought it was pretty good. You all let me know what you think. If you've seen any other videos from the channel, what do you think of the channel overall? I take a lot of y'all's input on what channels to do and which ones not to do, just because I feel like y'all kind of guide me in the right direction on that. So everybody let me know what you think. Put the comments down below on this particular topic and what you think about it. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the link to the Discord down below, and I'll see you all next time.